Hello and welcome friends to this second and concluding lecture on Savarkar. In the previous lecture we have discussed Savarkar as a patriot, as a revolutionary and also as a writer of India's first war of independence, that is about the 1857, which is also regarded or written about as a rebellion or a sepoy mutiny by many British and as well as Oriental and other scholars. Now, Savarkar through that text which becomes a kind of bible for many revolutionaries in India or Indian patriots living outside India, for the first time established the 1857 so called mutiny as India's first war of independence, and he traced the roots of such revolutionary movement in the long period of the suppressing or oppressive British rule, and there he also celebrated the Hindu-Muslim unity. So, we have studied some of these and also his ideas on nation and how he synthesized the territorial conception of nation as promoted by Congress and the religious and the cultural notion of nationalism as it was promoted by Muslim League in India, and he was trying to synthesize between the two to develop his own doctrine or conception of Hindutva, which is a political doctrine. Now, in this lecture today we are going to discuss in more details his views on Hindutva and how he differentiate Hindutva from the religious or the connotation of Hinduism, and Hinduism acquires a new interpretation, reinterpretation by many scholars including Gandhi, Tilak, Aurobindo Ghosh, Vivekananda and many other scholars, and Savarkar, although trying to develop his conception of nation on the basis of Hindu culture or Hindu religious practices or belief systems, he gave it a more political or a kind of approach which makes it more inclusive of different kinds of different religions or religious practices or belief systems which consider India not only as their fatherland but also as a holy land, and that give it a more kind of political character than the religious sectarian definition or interpretation of Hinduism. So, Savarkar differed from that. So, we will closely look at what is this difference between Hinduism and Hindutva and how Savarkar defines Hindutva. And also while defining Hindutva, Savarkar also gives a definition of Hindu, which is not someone who merely believes in a particular creed or a religious system, but also someone who consider himself part of a larger or ever inclusive cultural practices or civilizational heritage of this land which he called Hindustan. So, who is a Hindu and what constitute Hindu, that definition also we will try to understand through Savarkar, and finally we will try to understand or assess Savarkar's views on Hinduism or about political development or independent movement and his difference from Mahatma Gandhi, and then we will conclude his thought assessing about its relevance in understanding contemporary Indian politics. So, to begin with, we find in Savarkar and his thought that he left behind a contested legacy, and there remains an ever present challenge of critically engaging with his thought and ideas objectively, and this point we have discussed. So, there is a kind of shift or a kind of changes or evolvement in Savarkar as a thinker or a political activist from his early career as a revolutionary thinker or a revolutionary himself for the struggle against the British to an ideologue of Hindu nationalism, and then a pro-British attitude in his later lives seems to be a kind of problematic in understanding Savarkar's thoughts. So, for a group of people, Savarkar is celebrated or followed as a savior of Hinduism, but for the other he is discarded as a divisive thinker or someone who propagated militarization of Hinduism. So, this contested legacy of Savarkar make it difficult to critically engage with his thought and ideas in an objective manner. He provided a theoretical basis of Hindu Rashtra in his major work called Essentials of Hindutva, which he wrote in 1923 when he came back from Andaman and he was incarnated in the Ratnagiri jail. And he also engaged with the other ideas like Hinduism, Indian nationalism, status of national minorities, and these ideas continue to shape the contemporary debates and discussion on or about Indian politics, and that is something which is the powerful legacy of the man and his thought. So, even those who critique and those who support, certainly they can always refer to or derive their strength or inspiration from his thought and ideals, but even for the critic it is hard to ignore or sideline or undermine his thoughts and ideals. So, Savarkar and his philosophy remains ever present in any discussion and debates on contemporary politics. His theoretical writings are considered by many to have a Hindu revivalist overtones. Many texts he wrote about the 6 epochs of Hindus' glorious past just before his death. So, through such writings he provided a kind of theoretical basis, and that for many characterizes a kind of revivalist, Hindu revivalist overtones in Savarkar, whereas many other dispute such evaluation or assessment of Savarkar's thought. And in order to understand his thought, therefore, it is essentially to critically engage with his conception of Hinduism and Hindutva that we are going to do in next 20 or 25 minutes or so in this lecture. For Savarkar, Hindutva is a political doctrine and is different from Hinduism. He subscribed to a conceptual framework that related Hindutva to Indian nationhood. So, the way he was conceptualizing Hindutva as a political doctrine was also embedded or connected in the conception of Indian nationhood or Hindu Rashtra as he was portraying. So, he subscribed to a conceptual framework that related Hindutva to Indian nationhood, which focuses on one language and one culture, or ek bhasha and ek Sanskriti. And in Savarkar's conception of nation, besides the territorial boundary or limits of a nation, this cultural, linguistic or historical inheritance matters equally in the formation of nationhood. And we will discuss it that how Savarkar was in support of Hindi as the national language and Nagari as the script to write such language. So, Savarkar developed a kind of homogeneous or integral notion of nationhood, which focuses more on homogeneity than the cultural, religious, linguistic pluralism as argued by many others including Congress. So, this one language and one culture as the basis of formation of modern nation. This pan-Indian conceptualization of Indian nationhood of Savarkar made a sharp distinction between Muslims of India and the other minorities, and this is to do with his notion of Punya Bhumi and Pitra Bhumi. So, where many communities residing in India may consider India as their fatherland, but for them the Holy Land is far away from India, and therefore he make a kind of critical distinction in consolidating of different sections, different sects or samaj of one kind of belief systems or religious tradition, while excluding some other practices of belief systems or religious tradition. On Hindutva and Hinduism, this is described in his classic work, which is Hindutva or Who is a Hindu, or Essentials of Hindutva as it is called, and he has revised or added many other points in the later editions, but this text becomes the core of his philosophy, where he discusses this concept of Hindutva. For him, Hindutva is not a word but a history, not just religion, as with Hinduism. So, Hinduism for him is a more kind of sectarian belief systems or religious practices, but Hindutva is something broader, something bigger, and it allows the inclusiveness of different communities or belief systems which considers India both as a fatherland or also as a holy land, and excluding those who have a kind of divided loyalty towards India, considering fatherland and their holy land remains far away from India. So, for Savarkar, Hindutva is not merely a word or not just a religion such as Hinduism, but history in full, and this history in full is a kind of millennium or different epochs of glorious Hindu past that Savarkar goes on to describe in his later writings. So, according to Savarkar, Hindutva was not a word or a creed or a religion, but a history. It was not only a history of the spiritual or the religious life of the Indian people, but a history of the entire civilization. So, that is a kind of all encompassing broader view about Hindutva or Hindu civilization, which is much broader, much bigger than the narrow sectarian conceptualization of Hinduism as a particular creed or particular belief systems. And this difference, which we often took interchangeably, Hinduism and Hindutva, Hindu as the basis of Hinduism, is something which becomes the kind of enigma or a kind of problematic in his thought. But for analytical purpose, it is necessary to make this distinction between Savarkar's approach using his utilitarian, rationalist and also pragmatic approach of redefining nationhood or nation by using a particular belief systems or civilization, but critically distinguishing that belief systems or tradition from the a kind of narrowly sectarian kind of practices or religious dogmas, etc. So, for him this Hindutva was not only a history of the spiritual or the religious life of Indian people, but a history of their entire civilization. Hinduism is only a derivative, a fraction or a part of Hindutva, or maybe a major part of Hindutva, but Hindutva is something which is more about the civilizational heritage of the Hindu people, or in many of the judgments of the Supreme Court also, when you say Hindu, who is a Hindu, how to define a Hindu and how to define the Hinduism, it becomes a kind of problematic term, because there is no such organized institution as you find in other religion, or no one particular text which can define Hinduism. So, during this period of Indian Renaissance, which we call, or the beginning of nationalist imagination and consciousness, there is the attempt to interpret or reinterpret in Hinduism in different way, and many scholars were involved in such re-articulation of Hinduism, and it remains a kind of evasive term to define in a analytically neat and clean way. But Savarkar radicalized such reinterpretation of Hinduism or heterogeneous belief systems or religious practices by giving it a more political outlook or more political orientation through this notion of Hindutva. So, Savarkar asserts that the failures to distinguish between these two terms, Hinduism and Hindutva, have given rise to so much of misunderstanding and mutual suspicions between some of the communities that have inherited inestimable characteristics and common treasures from the same Hindu civilization. So, Hinduism or Hindu civilization is also considered as a way of life, as a philosophy, or as a system of practices, beliefs and faiths which remains somewhat ever accommodative and flexible enough to include new insights, new ideas, and redefine itself in the context of newly emerging situations or challenges. So, the Hindu civilization or Hinduism as a way of life, which is very different from Hinduism as a belief system or as a faith or as a sectarian creed system. Savarkar wanted to make this distinction, and this one can understand perhaps in the historical context, where there is a kind of as we have discussed in the previous lecture, the colonial policies of divide and rule and increasing fragmentation of the Hindu communities. So, Savarkar is also trying to using his pragmatic approach of taking every communities along, and Savarkar played a significant role in social and religious reforms also, especially the untouchability or Patit Pavan temple which he constructed, and many such attempts refer to his integrative approach towards consolidating the Hindu communities, and also the Sikhism demanding for separate status, and many Buddhism and Jainism similarly others. So, Savarkar actually was trying to consolidate them together to have a kind of integral view of a nation or Hindu nationhood, which is very different from a kind of sectarian belief systems in the form of Hinduism. And he wanted to make this analytical distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva to resolve some of the misconception or misunderstanding among different communities which believes or derive their ideals from the same Hindu civilization. In order to investigate into the essential significance of Hindutva, Savarkar did not primarily concern himself with any particular theocratic or religious dogma or creed. He held that had linguistic usage not stood in the way, Hindu-ness would have been a better word than Hinduism, as a nearer parallel to his philosophy of Hindutva. So, first thing which is quite clear and evident is Savarkar's conception of Hindutva is nothing to do with a particular or any one theocratic or religious dogmas or creed, but he wanted to use this term Hindu-ness as nearer to his philosophy of Hindutva than Hinduism, and therefore the Hindutva remains a kind of political doctrine, political approach towards constructing a Hindu Rashtra, and there the definition of Hindu differ very much from just being a follower of a particular creed. For Savarkar, Hinduism or who is a Hindu and its constituting elements differ very much from the other conception of Hinduism and Hindu or Hinduism. So, according to Savarkar, isms of all kind represents dogmas or creeds, whereas Hindutva does not. For him, Hindutva is a kind of political objective or a kind of political approach to politics to construct a nation in according to the ideals, belief systems and civilizational heritage of a civilization of a communities residing or inhabiting a geography over a millennia, and he construct his conception of nation on the basis of that inheritance. So, according to Savarkar, Hinduism must necessarily mean the religion and the religious that are peculiar and native to this land. This land means Bharatvarsha or India and people, and he defined Hindus in terms of three essential features. So, Hindu as a nation or as a Rashtra, Hindu as a race or a Jati, and this conception of Hindu as a race or a Jati is very different from the official or everyday use of the term Jati as caste, and as a civilization or a Sanskriti, and these all are not different or isolated from each other. It is a kind of together it constitute what Savarkar was trying to construct as a Hindu Rashtra, what should be the basis of such Rashtra. So, he defined Hindus in terms of all these three things: Hindu as a nation, there as a Rashtra, Hindu Rashtra, as a race, as a Jati and as a civilization. So, all these things together constitute his conception of Hindutva or how to constitute a Hindu Rashtra. Now, the first important qualification of a Hindu is that for him the whole continental country from the Indus, that is a river in the northwest boundary of India, and the seas, that is the southern most point, is not only a Pitra Bhumi but a Punya Bhum. Pitra Bhu or a Punya Bhu, not only a fatherland but a holy land as well. So, for Savarkar's conception of a Hindu is the one who believes not just in the whole continental country from Indus to the sea, and their attachment to this land is not only as a Pitribhu but also as a Punyabhu. In other words, not only as a fatherland but also as a holy land. So, in his famous speech to the Hindu Mahasabha session in Nagpur 1938, he insisted that this land must be reserved for the Hindu, and there is the only possibility or basis of Indian nationhood that should be based on Hindu Sanskriti, and there the Hindu word is not synonymous, not similar to the word of Hinduism or any particular creed, but a kind of civilizational heritage which those who inhabited this land from Indus to the sea developed over its millennia, and there have been different epochs of such glorious past of Hindu. So, Savarkar early projection of Hindu Muslim unity was then completely reversed during his transportation to the Andaman from 1911 to 1921, and his Hindutva was articulated as a political ideology, as I was saying, not a kind of religious doctrine or conception, but a political ideology of ethno-religious nationalism. So, if one can put his conception of nation or nationhood, it will be more a kind of ethno-religious nationalism to include culture and race in the territorial definition of nation. So, it was designed to unify and mobilize the inegalitarian classes and hierarchical castes among Hindus under a communal banner of Hindutva or Hinduism. So, the divides, the hierarchy, the inegalitarian status of different sects within the Hindu community, through this philosophy of Hindutva, Savarkar was trying to consolidate such or unify such hierarchies or inegalitarian status of different communities. So, this he wanted to do through Hinduizing the all sphere of national life, and in 1941 on the occasion of his birthday, the slogan that was given is Hinduize all politics and militarize all Hinduism. So, he wanted Hindus to discipline themselves, to acquire physical strength, to protect their nation or the motherland. So, Savarkar was of the opinion that Hindutva embraced all the department of thought and activity of whole beings of Hindu race. He held that to understand Hindutva, one should understand first the essential meanings of the word Hindu itself and realize how it came to exercise such control over the hearts and minds of the millions of inhabitants in Hindustan. And he stated the word Hindutva, the word Hindutva's association are so varied and rich, so powerful and so subtle, so elusive and yet so vivid that the term Hindutva defies all attempts at analysis. So, one cannot clearly define or analyze what it constitutes and what it is. So, it is a kind of ever inclusive conception to include different sects, different beliefs, systems, practices, religious cults in one consolidated identity of Hindutva. So, however, Savarkar felt it imperative to point out that he was by no means attempting a definition or even a description of the more limited, less satisfactory and essentially sectarian term Hinduism. So, Savarkar in his analysis was more concerned about describing or constructing his conception of Hindutva, and he was very less bothered about what he considered essentially sectarian term such as Hinduism, and then he goes on to explain who is a Hindu. Now, Savarkar regarded the contestation surrounding the question who is a Hindu as the main source of misunderstandings and confusions in defining what is a Hindutva. So, for him, Hindu, who is a Hindu, is not someone who believes and practices a particular creed or a religious system, but for him Hindu is someone who inherited in the civilizational values or beliefs from his ancestors and share certain common characteristics and traits with them, and they together consist even they differ in their beliefs, in their religious beliefs or in their religious practices. So, Savarkar then went on to examine these constituting elements of a Hindu and who is a Hindu in the text essentials of Hindutva. So, according to Savarkar, every person was a Hindu who regarded this land as a fatherland as well as holy land, Pitrabhu or Punyabhu that we have just discussed. So, Savarkar held that the followers of Vaidism, Sanatanism, Jainism, Buddhism, Lingayatism, Sikhism, Arya Samaj or different Samaj, Brahma Samaji, Dev Samaj or Prajna Samaj and such other religion of Hindustani origin were Hindus and constituted Hindudom. So, that is a kind of broader canvas to include all these different sects, beliefs, faiths, creeds to consolidate them into a one particular political force which he called Hindudom, because for them this land was both their fatherland as well as their holy land. However, Savarkar opined that the Indian Muslims, Christians and Jews, also Parsis, were excluded from the right to claim themselves as Hindu in spite of India being their fatherland, because their holy land was very far away from them, India. So, his conception of nation or Hindu nation is based on this loyalty to India, not just as a fatherland but also as a holy land, and those communities which claim their holy land outside India, Savarkar excluded them from his conception of who is a Hindu. In his philosophy of Hindutva, Savarkar minimized the importance of religious criteria in the definition of a Hindu by claiming that Hinduism was not was only one of the attributes of Hinduness, which he considered as more closer to his conception of Hindutva. The notion of territory was at the heart of Savarkar's ideological construct, the holy land or the fatherland. So, the territory remains very significant in his thought or ideological construct, but not in the same way as in the universalist conception of nationalism. So, territory is necessary attributes or characteristic of a modern nation state universally, but Savarkar's conception of territory is very different from this universal approach or conception of nationalism. For Savarkar, the territory of India could not be dissociated from Hindu culture, and he used it interchangeably or in a synonymous way. So, for him the territory of India could not be dissociated from the Hindu culture, which he defines in a broader sense than Hinduism, and the Hindu people. In his opinion, Hindus were preeminently the descendant of the Aryans who made it their home and lit the first sacrificial fire on the bank of Indus or Sindhu, a river which he considered to be the western border of the Hindu nation. So, his conception of territory and the inheritance of such territory by a particular descendant of Aryan race who first came, settled there, made their home and evolved the history or culture around that cannot be dissociated from the territory of India, and the both are deeply intertwined in his conception of nationhood. So, Savarkar held that the Hindus were not merely the citizens of the Indian state, it is because they were united not merely by the bonds of love for a common motherland, but also by the bonds of a common blood. So, the racial characteristic of Hindutva is equally emphasized upon. In contrast with the universalist and the territorial pattern of nationalism, he emphasized upon the ethnic and racial substance of the Hindu nation. Again, the synthesizing or combining the territorial with the cultural or the racial or the ethnic substance in conception of his understanding of nation. The emphasis placed on the racial criteria minimized the importance of internal divisions in Hindu society by assuming the existence of an invisible but potent benefactor, that of blood. So, we are the children of the same forefathers or same ancestors who first came and settled on the bank of Sindhu or Sindhu river, and that the bond of blood also constitute his identity of who is a Hindu, despite of the internal segregation differences on the basis of caste, language, beliefs and creeds. So, this is the second criteria of blood in his conception of who is a Hindu. The third criteria of Hindutva is a common culture or a Sanskriti. As defined by Savarkar, this stemmed directly from the crucial importance of rituals, social rules and language in Hinduism. So, he saw it as a kind of unifying force of those inhabitants who consider this land as a fatherland or also as a holy land, or they are tied together by the bond of blood, the common blood that run in their veins. So, these two criteria further get consolidated by this third criteria of a common culture or a common outlook or a common way of life. So, Savarkar held that the Hindus were bound together not only by the ties of a common fatherland, but also by the tie of the common homage they pay to their great civilization, the Hindu culture, which is very different from the many pluralist or other kind of conception of Hinduism. So, Savarkar opined that the Sanskrit language was the common language of the Hindu race, and he held that the Sanskrit had been the chosen means of expression and preservation of Hindu culture. However, in the modern conceptualization of nation, he supported Hindi to be the mother language written in the Nagari script, and he wanted different communities, different linguistic groups to adopt Nagari as the script and Hindi as the national language in modern times. Besides language, common laws and rights such as religious festivals were cited as the criteria of Hindutva by Savarkar, and there is the kind of engaging with the distancing in analytically from Hinduism in his conception of Hindutva, but at the same time there is a kind of overlapping concern, overlapping definition, where the common laws, rights, the social values of a particular communities are included in his criteria of Hindutva as well. So, Savarkar argued that when the Muslims forced their entry into India, the conflict of life and death begins. There is a kind of churning within the Hindu community once they encountered the Muslims, and that in his opinion pose a threat to the very existence of Hindu civilization or Hindu culture. So, however, he also admitted its positive effects. In his own words, and this comes with his understanding of survival of the fittest, and some of the philosophical insights he derived from the experiences of the Western civilization. So, he regarded this encounter of life and death as a positive effect on Hindu civilization, and in his words, this conflict between Hindus and the Muslims had about life and death of their beliefs or their practices, religious practices. This conflict had a positive effect, since nothing makes conscious of itself so much as a conflict with non-self. So, the other and encounter with the other in the constitution of the self is something which is desirable and which has positive impacts in according to Savarkar, and that is true in many continental philosophers also. The constitution of the self requires the encounter or differentiation of the self from the other. So, in that way it constitute or it help in constituting the more clearer conception of the self as well. So, in sum, Savarkar's notion of Hindutva rested on the cultural criteria rather than on a racial theory, and was accordingly in tune with the Brahmanical worldview to a great extent, but at the same time it represented an ethnic nationalism which borrowed much from the Western political theory, especially from the Italian conception of Italian thinkers' conception of nation, especially from Mazzini and Garibaldi. So, Savarkar opined that not territorial unity, but the religious, racial and cultural unity counted more in the formation of a national unit, and therefore his conception of Hindu Rashtra, not just based on a territory, but also based on the culture and life of the particular people inhabiting that territory. So, according to Savarkar, the idea of territorial nationality alone was envisaged by congressmen, who in general preferred to be totally ignorant of the Muslim history, theology and political trend of mind. However, he argued that while conceptualizing Hindu Rashtra or Hindu nation, from the Indus to the Himalayas, and from Himalayas to Tibet, and from Tibet to Burma, and from Burma to southern and western seas, run the lines of the boundaries of our land. Whole territory including Kashmir and Nepal, Pondicherry and other French possessions constitutes our national and territorial unit, and this whole constitutes our country Hindustan, and it must remain one, indivisible and integral. So, therefore, Savarkar, while accepting this two nation theory as promoted by Muslim League and Jinnah, refused to accept division of the territory, because for him the Hindu Rashtra constitute this whole territory, and it must remain one, indivisible and integral. Now, on his relationship with minorities and others, we have discussed in the last lecture, where he thought about the role and status of minorities, but he made it conditional, that they should accept this land as a Hindu Rashtra, or immerse themselves in the accept the culture and beliefs of the Hindu majority. So, he was against any kind of preferential treatment therefore to the minorities community, and yet giving them a status to reside in the country in a somewhat secondary status or similar way, and that becomes a kind of critical point for Savarkar. Now, to look at the difference between Savarkar and Gandhi, we find that it is true that Savarkar had in many ways strong differences with Gandhi and his model of politics, especially Satyagraha and non-violence. Savarkar argued against the irrational practices of religious rituals and advocated for science and rationality in this age of machines and technology, and therefore he criticized a lot of dogmatic or irrational practices in the Hinduism, and wanted to refine it using science or reason of modern era. So, his use of religion in political life was to unify people for the cause of Indian independence. Gandhi too used such imagery, as we have discussed, the idea of Ramraj, Satya, Ahimsa. Such vocabulary he draws from Hinduism or Jainism to mobilize public opinion. However, Gandhi's challenge to outdated religious practices was much more silent than the Savarkar. Savarkar was outright critique of many practices, and he wanted to remove such dogmas and irrational practices from the Hinduism, and to refine it for making it a kind of more consolidated unifying force, and removing all the hierarchy or segregation among different communities inhabiting India. So, he was very vocal, outright critique of such dogmas in Hinduism. Despite its pretensions to be nationalist and modern, his conception of Hindutva, its militant chauvinism makes Savarkar's Hindutva an antithesis of Gandhi's Hinduism. So, Savarkar, despite of its projection as a nationalist or a modern framework for politics, his conception remains opposite or antithesis to Gandhian conception of Hinduism. So, Savarkar want all Indians to be Hindus and claim India as a Hindu nation. However, Gandhi's Hinduism is accommodative or ever inclusive and give space to everyone for all the creeds. Savarkar was opposed to the absolute non-violence doctrine of Gandhi, but there is no record of him personally resorting to violence. So, he justified the use of violence for political independence, for protection of a nation when there is a kind of invasion from the foreign land to protect the nation. So, Savarkar has a kind of relative approach to the question of violence or morality in politics, and therefore he was more pragmatic than a kind of absolute theorist of non-violence like Gandhi about politics. So, in conclusion, we find Savarkar, a former president of the Hindu Mahasabha, is often regarded as an early exponent of militant Hindu nationalism. Many also continue to hold him and his ideology responsible for the assassination of Gandhi, despite his acquittal in the case by the Supreme Court. Many people continue to believe, and that is a kind of contested legacy of Savarkar, and also a challenge to understand or engage with his ideas and thought critically without being entrapped by his loyal supporters or by his staunch critique. Savarkar's is a largely misunderstood legacy. Both his followers and critics are responsible for reducing him to caricatures. One as a patriot, revolutionary and a savior of Hinduism, and the other as a bigot who believed in the militarization of Hindu religion and propagator of communal hatredness. Both these extremes do not give the space or engages with the various nuances or various sides of his philosophy and thought. So, Savarkar made a number of contribution in the struggle of freedom, developed his thought. It may have relevance and it continues to shape many discourses in the contemporary politics. There is some vital ideas, conceptions which we need to engage seriously, more critically. But this binary or this polarization among the followers or the critique of Savarkar most of the time do not allow such critical engagement with his thoughts and ideals. So, Savarkar, when he wrote the first war of independence, was a revolutionary, developing his conception of a revolution which is very different from, say, communist or leftist revolution, and trying to envision a country or a nation in a very particular way. But his reduction or his synonymous with the ideologue of Hindu nationalism or Hindu its definition as a sectarian or a particular belief systems which is very different from Savarkar conception of Hindutva, do not allow perhaps these nuances to come or to engage with them more critically and academically. So, his ideology is often confused with those of Kesavrao Balirao Hedgewar or M.S. Golwalkar, the early leaders of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. The right-wing organization Savarkar was never part of, although he was the inspiration or he provided advice or suggestion to many of these leaders, but he himself was never part of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, but more often he is and his thoughts and ideologies are clubbed together with the Golwalkar and the Kesavrao Balirao Hedgewar. So, on the other hand, prominent members of the left like M.N. Roy, Hirendranath Mukherjee and Sripad Amrit Dange held him in great esteem. So, as we were discussing, when Savarkar was articulating his thought or practicing his ideas, engaging in the social religious reforms as well as in the political movement or his idea of a revolutionary. So, despite of their differences, they used to communicate and respect each other. So, as I was saying, Gandhi used to write to him and made personal visit to him when he returned from Andaman. So did Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose. But in contemporary and many as we have seen, those who are in the left of the spectrum also considered his contribution in the high esteem. But for good or for bad, Savarkar in his contemporary incarnation is regarded merely as the ideologue of Hindu nationalism, which he was, but then the other side of his contributions remain somewhat undermined, which we need to closely engage with when we think or engage with his ideas on nation or nationhood. So, many of Savarkar's ideas on social and religious reforms on the use of science, reason and rationality and building a strong state continue to be extremely relevant for India. His controversial position on Hindutva continues to occupy an important place in current political debates. Therefore, to deeply engage with his ideas remains crucial to understand the contemporary politics that is unfolding in India. So, Savarkar in my opinion remains a crucial figure, and his ideas we need to perhaps closely engage with to understand the challenges of contemporary politics, and that is why he remain a kind of inevitable thinker, and his texts remain so crucial to understand many of the challenges of our contemporary politics. Now, on Savarkar, you can look at some of these texts like by Dhananjay Keer, Savarkar and his times. sources of Indian traditions. There are chapters on his views on Hinduism, which you can look at. Also political thought in modern India, and Savarkar and Hindutva by Sukla Sen, P.R. Ram, Irfan Engineer, Uday Mehta and Asad bin Saif, which is about Savarkar and Hindutva in Economic and Political Weekly, and also Gandhi's Hinduism and Savarkar's Hindutva by Rudolph C. Heredia, again from Economic and Political Weekly. So these are some of the readings which you can refer to understand Savarkar's ideas on Hinduism and Hindutva. You can also refer to his original Essentials of Hindutva 1923 classic work to define his conception of a Hindu Rashtra, and then you develop your own conception or your own critique or admiration for his thought and ideals without being entrapped in this polarized response to Savarkar and his ideas by his supporter on the one hand and by the critique on the other. So there is a need to engage with him and his thought besides this polarized understanding or caricaturing of Savarkar and his thought. So that's all for this lecture. Thank you for listening and thanks for your patience. Thank you.